what I'd like to do this morning is to continue our discussion on some of the aspects of family that's so much a part of the rehabilitation process. Generally speaking, it doesn't work. But if it's done correctly, rarely it will. But former felons who have mental health issues find it far more difficult than felons coming home into somewhat already families that are destabilized. So I'm going to go back and just share a paragraph that I think is very important for us to remember. Now, men coming home from prison, and this of course would apply to women too, that I'm sure, but mostly with men in terms of my own experiences, but men who are coming home can be strongly influenced in their thinking and behavior based upon the emotional situation that they find with their families. Pardon me. Actually, based on what has been my experience with them, whole families can become mentally anguished with depression due to the incarceration of a loved one. And what happens in this situation when families, they find that their financial obligations have to be borne by them, and they nurse at times the persistent feeling that an injustice has been done, that the loved one should not have been placed in prison. And in some cases, you'll find inevitable bitterness that not only overcomes the family towards the justice system, but also towards the incarcerant, which causes a severe rupture of trust and confidence that has the potential to carry over to parole or release. And what this does, particularly when parole is in the picture, it endangers the privacy of family life. The parole officer has the strongest role of authority within the family, not a member of the family itself. Now, what this does, it traps the many people coming out of prison in terms of what they failed to discern or to understand while incarcerated. And that is, and this is important, that especially families that are poor and dependent, these families suffer much due to an incarcerant's indiscretions, leaving the returnee and their families at times oppositional. They will not get along. They will not have a level of agreement, no balance within the family. Whenever the family looks at this person coming out of prison as the one most responsible for the failures of that family. So we have many men returning home from prison who are immediately faced with poverty. That certainly doesn't help their situation. Welfare. And with all of that, it brings social powerlessness. A person coming home from prison running into all of this poverty, welfare system, even where there is no criminality, families who are very poor, who must depend upon welfare or some county funds in order to survive, they find themselves without any social powerlessness at all. So incarceration extends and perpetuates the poverty circle among some families and seriously affects the attitudes of children. It seriously affects the attitudes of children. Whether we can say unfortunately or not, generally speaking, there are numbers of children within this family construct. Now, welfare for the immediate family assaults an ex-offender's manhood. A man coming out of prison, reunited with his family, cannot in most instances resume whatever responsibility they had prior to being incarcerated. So with the family now dependent upon welfare, what manhood an ex-offender has is challenged. Because inwardly, they want to assume responsibility for the corporal sustenance of his own family. If either one of us were the one most totally capable of taking care of our families, and suddenly that's taken away, we go to prison, we come out, we have no power, we have no job, we have nothing. The family is surviving only on welfare, and the parole officer tells you, go down to welfare. I have seen many, many men who have looked upon this as really an assault upon their manhood. And when a parole officer, if a person is on parole, encourages welfare for the parolee, causes another problem. Because individual welfare for an ex-offender can have debilitating repercussions. But oftentimes this is the only link to any kind of money, albeit not much. But situations as such offers no disruption of the family poverty cycle. It keeps going around and around. And in most instances, there will be no employment, none for the returnee. Most firms, most businesses will not hire an ex-offender. And where there exists any kind of mental anxiety, whether it's borderline or activated, you can count on this: domestic strife. It serves to exacerbate the situation and can result in family friction that can lead to forms of domestic violence. The majority of recidivation is the result of domestic violence. Yes?
Do you think that a lot of it is like the kick the dog phenomenon, where like this man is having his manhood like insulted, and he has all of this like like wrath sort of coming down on him from his parole officer, and then he needs someone to take it out on, so he takes it out on his wife.
Yeah, I do. I think it's been shown that that is the case. I think, too, that the failure to be received by family can be very painful. When I say received, I mean received with some degree of pleasure and affirmation that he is home now. When that isn't there, all of this and what you have described with respect to the parole officer certainly does have its way. It's unfortunate, but when you have no power, and when for at least, let's say, 5 years or more, you have been mentally under the control of a system, an institutional system, I think with that, it's very, very hard to develop any kind of strong mental self-determinative direction. Yes.
Just kind of going off of that, I think it's definitely exacerbated by like the general failings of our prison system, where there's no like emotional or like personal rehabilitation going on,
Right.
or very little of it, and so a lot of those social interactions they're very unprepared for, because like society and life inside of prison is so like completely different from life outside, and so when they have like idealized this like magical life outside of the prison where they can make their own decisions and they can make all of the choices for themselves and their family, and they realize that all of those choices are like so severely limited that it kind of puts an increased stress back on them when they thought that like what the struggles of prison like would have been over by then, but they come back out and they realize that they still have very limited choice just because of the failings of our like society and prison system.
Mm-hmm. That's good perspective. Things get really in a swirl. You mentioned rehabilitative services. Sometimes they're offered in terms of just general information. If you go here, you can get some help. You go here and get some help. Very, very seldom does that occur unless it's mandated. For persons who are released from prison from heavy drug charges, they are basically mandated to go to anti-drug rehabilitative programs, and a role is taken. If they don't go, they're subject themselves to being imprisoned again. So there's a very heavy mandate on some of the people. Where there's no mandate, there generally isn't any kind of recuperative motion at all. When we get to the end of this, we'll talk about restoration, but restoration, unless you're in an institution such as a religious institution that has special ministries to deal with these special situations, there's very little to choose from. Even today, look at this. I'm trying to think. Let me just pull out a year. Let's say 1978. 1978 was 7 years beyond the Attica uprising and about 6 years beyond the rash of prison outbreaks that we experienced. None greater than the situation in Rochester, which resulted in about 41 people being killed. But in 1978, still, within the Rochester community, there were 7 post-release programs. 7. All of which, I think, maybe all but 1 or 2, provided a stipend to encourage ex-felons to come, just to sit and see how you can be helped. One of the things that has led to a great deal of disappointment on the part of these men is when they spend years in prison being involved in college extension programs and really better themselves academically. They learn how to write, they learn how to at least communicate a little bit, and they get glowing reports from these extensions, these academic extension programs saying, you've done very, very good, you deserve a B or you deserve an A. And when they get through it with a GED, they have a graduation ceremony right there at the prison. But then when they come out, they learn that that which they have acquired is worth absolutely zero. No college will accept a person who has earned their high school diploma as a prisoner of the state. So this, I've talked with some guys who've had grandiose ideas because they think they've earned even a master's degree in prison, and that the prison program, the extension program of the prison is valid. It's something that you can't rebuke. It's valid, but it's not valid. It is not valid to these universities, simply because the extension program of most of these colleges and most of these universities act independently from the college. And the money that they get to do this, that's why they do it. They get money to do it. From the let's say, take New York State, from the New York State legislature. But we know now that all that's dried up. They can get anything now. They've just about terminated every program, every academic program. The only programs they haven't terminated are the programs that the prison themselves offer. Refrigeration skills, air conditioning, computer science, things of this nature, which will help them, but will not guarantee them anything. So when they come out, the feeling of powerlessness has not gone away, particularly after being rejected either academically or rejected by way of employment opportunities that really don't exist. It's really up to the heart and mind of those who are in control of factories and other places. I did deal with a group that was close to a major industry in this city. It was called the Northern Packing Company, and they dealt with meats, frozen meats and things like that. And it had a husband and wife team, Donald and Betty Harris. I met them kind of off and aside because Donald is from a little town called Zanesville, Ohio, and I used to go to Zanesville a lot. So it wasn't too far from where I lived, maybe 100 miles. In Zanesville, the only Y bridge in the world is there, straight down, then veers off like a Y. That's the only bridge in the world that's like that. But we drive across there just to be driving across. But at any rate, the Northern Packing Company, they were very kind. They said if we could send them one or two ex-offenders, and if they worked out, they would employ ex-offenders. So for a couple of years, it did work out good. They had about 4 or 5 men who came in and established themselves and really worked to the benefit of the company. Then we had a guy who got out of Attica, and we recommended him to Northern Packing. They accepted him, and we thought he was off to a good start because the reports that came back on him was that he had, I've forgotten what the term was, but something like an aptitude for leadership. So they gave him the responsibility. He got special permission from the parole officer to do this, to drive a truck and to deliver certain goods around the state, which was a fantastic opportunity. The first day that he had the truck, he absconded in the truck, and he became a fugitive because he was on parole. This ended the relationship between the office that I had and the Northern Packing Company, because I was told the first infringement by an ex-offender would end the program. And so we always encourage it, you do your best to do this because you got other people coming after you. You do this, you don't mess it up, you do it as best you can. Same thing we used to tell students. I used to tell students at MCC, don't mess up. You've got the Pell Grant, you got this, you got that. Don't spend it on yourself. You spend it on what you need to go to school. Don't mess it up. But a lot of students weren't even going to class or anything. So what happened? Over the years, they cut it. Then they eliminated it. Then they were on their own financially to do some things. But they brought it upon themselves to say, what you're going to do, once you start this, you're going to hurt people that are coming behind who really need this. And that's what we were telling ex-offenders. Don't mess up. Do the very best you can, the best you can. If you do the best you can, you'll keep the door open for others to come in. But that's one instance of where it just doesn't work. The employee, if the employer rather, if he is not sensitive, she is not sensitive to the needs of ex-offenders, or if anyway the ex-offender does not do what they're supposed to do with respect to their opportunities to work and to make money, help their families, then the situation, the negative part of it is increased. Any questions? Okay. Now, there are always situations where violence in many such families becomes inevitable. Now, caught in the grip of negative poverty creates a stressful tension that can become not only disruptive, but dangerous as well. Conflict in families of ex-offenders can produce not only predictable violence, but because of various suspicions, lack of inter-family trust, the use of drugs and alcohol, chronic unemployment, criminal re-involvement, and very importantly, the inability of ex-offenders to develop a more positive peer group, lack of a sustaining spiritual base. All of these dramatically contribute to family fallout. And there is always the possibility of family violence by parole officer power and threats, which plays directly into the fear of recidivism, going back to prison. I think you all know that parole officers have a tremendous amount of authority. Whatever they tell a family it must do. If it tells an inmate, even though that you're home now, you're on parole, you have to be home by 11 o'clock at night. Parole officers have the right to come by a home or a workplace at any time, unannounced. And if things aren't according to his perspective of well and good, then ex-offender is simply recidivated. Another problem here is the fact that wives or women who live with men who are coming out of a incarcerative situation have a lot of power in that they can call a parole officer at any time, and depending upon the word of the wife or the person calling, the man can be sent right back to prison. And some women carry this over a man, that if you don't do this, or you don't do that, or if you don't stop doing this, stop doing that, I'll just simply call you a parole officer. And I've known that to happen many, many times. What I want to look at now is family criminality and children. I don't know of too many studies that have gone into trying to gauge the influence of criminal behavior within families upon children. I think it is a neglected field of study, of research. Maybe one of you might concentrate on that a little bit in your post-education. But family criminality in children is a reality. I did mention a moment ago that within these families, generally we have children, sometimes a number of them. Well, whether it's one or whether it's 5. It warrants our involvement. And again, I don't think that there's been much research that has been recorded relative to the importance that crime has on the lives of children living in families where we have incarcerated or former incarcerated individuals. Children have always been influenced by forms of images. You know, all of us have been children. We recognize the importance that images had with ours. Some of these are both self-conceived, or they can be created by others, such as the media. And the best illustration of that would be the cartoons. Every Saturday morning, all of us, didn't you? You run downstairs, turn on TV and watch Looney Tunes and all this other stuff. At my age, I had to get it in the movies, but we'd go to the movies and we'd be very disappointed if in between the two movies, double features always, in between the two movies you didn't have a cartoon. Cartoons were why we went to the movies, basically. But these images persist. But the threat to the well-being of children who are living in families where there are incarcerated males is the fact that some of these children adopt a hero image of their biological brother, uncle, or father who is in prison. And this can be personally dangerous to a child because it produces thinking that crime, imprisonment, and even violence is accepted and anticipated behavior, especially when his peers all around him suffer from the same malady of biological male incarceration. I wouldn't be sharing this if I didn't know it to be true. Let me tell you something about myself. I think I mentioned it to you earlier, but for 9 years, 9.5 years, I was the associate director of the Rochester chapter, Big Brothers, Big Sisters program. Wonderful program. In all of my 9.5 years, none of our little brothers or little sisters went to prison, not one, because they were matched with very positive adults. But not every child that came into the program ended up being matched because we carried a caseload of nearly 300 children between the ages of 6 and 16 That we were really not supposed to match a child under 6, not over 16. Many families that I interviewed, and they would bring their child, parents would bring their child, or the guardian would bring the child to the interview. Many who I interviewed, the mother particularly, would bring a boy to be matched with a positive male adult because the father was incarcerated. The mother had fears that the boy would grow up without the presence of a positive male in their life, and I would agree. But some of these boys, as young as 8 and 9 years old, would resist being matched with the big brother because they loved their fathers and they wanted to be like their dad. Their dad was a crook. And they felt that this is what they had to become. Again, the peerage. The fact that we had a lot of very poor families with children, with boy children, who idolized and who imitate as much as possible, not only people in prison, men in prison, but men in the neighborhood. Some had fathers who were not in prison, but they lived apart, and they were involved in criminal behavior. And boys knew this, and they wanted to be like their father because they loved their fathers. So this incident that we have seen developing over the past 40 years has also played a role in the extension of criminal activity within families. You know, the old saying, like father, like son. That's great if your father's an achiever, or it doesn't have to be an achiever, just a guy that works hard, lives a decent life, raises his children to be better than him. That's a great father to me. Yes.
I think what I've seen a lot is not that they want to become their father or whoever they're idolizing because they think that they're great, but because they feel a sense of loyalty.
Yeah, they
to that
do.
person.
They do.
And so when you try to make them have a big brother or whatever, they kind of feel like wrong and that they're being disloyal to their father or brother or uncle. And then if you take it on a more grand scale, there's a sense of loyalty to the community. So like, I kind of had that same thing where I felt the need to like not prosper because that would make me disloyal to my community. Because when I did begin to kind of break away, I experienced a lot of resistance from people in my community that had helped me for so many years. And so there's almost a fear of being ostracized for breaking whatever chains that hold your community. If you break against them, you're not seen as one anymore.
Yeah, that's possible. Very possible. And you're right, because that is one of the major, it was, when I was there, one of the major reasons some of these children would reject a volunteer. Every now and then you'll find that with a female child, but very, very rarely. Let me tell you a story. And this is a true story. I won't give you the name of the family because you might know them, or at least you might be able to put some pieces together. I don't know. This is not a large city. But there was a family. Listen to this. Father had been in prison. They had about 8 children. Father had lived with the mother. They were married. They had about 8 children. And the first 7 children, by birth, the first 7, from the first child to the 7th child, all did bids in state prison, including 2 girls. This other one, the number 8 child, the mother brought him to big brothers and big sisters to be matched. I don't want to play on any kind of racial dynamic because I don't think it applies. But the child was African American. He was about 10 years old. The police were always coming to the house. Parole officers were always coming to the house. And as soon as they would release from prison, one of his siblings, they would get in trouble with the law and would be reincarcerated. Well, the mother was very clear and very candid as to why she wanted him matched. She's trying to get him away from all of this. At that point, he had never had any trouble with the law, about 10. There was a white young man, Caucasian, who, when fielding the 5 potential children that he could be matched with, we gave him 1 African American, 1 Hispanic boy, and 3 white boys. But this was a young white man. He was about 22, 23 years old, just starting his professional life. And when he called and said that he had made his choice, we were somewhat surprised that his choice was the young brother. They were matched for a number of years. He would pick the boy up, take him driving to his college for homecoming and things of this nature, football games, go to the movies. They did a lot of things that boys just love to do. Fish, bowl. This child did so well that he graduated from high school, the first child in that family ever to graduate from high school, and he went on to college. And we used to use him as a model. Now, I don't think that was fair, but I enjoyed doing it. You know, look, this is what happens. This is a possibility of what can happen. But it did happen. And that boy's life is so totally different from the lives of his siblings that it would be almost impossible to gauge if they were from the same family. I think 2 of his brothers who were in this prison thing died from AIDS, HIV/AIDS, and one lost his life in the community, and I don't know about the others. But I know this child, he did very, very well. He's a man now. He must be, 35 or so, mid-30s at least. And thanks to a big brother, thanks for somebody intervening in his life who was supportive and helpful and was an advocate for him. Thanks to that, and not to the influences he could have garnered from his siblings or even from his father, the boy made it. Chances are his children will be born in far more pleasant circumstances, probably now, and are off on the right track. But it has nothing to do with genes as much as it has to do with environment. And we just need a lot of big brothers and big sisters, that's all. His case was outstanding, but it was duplicated, not quite as dramatically, but it was duplicated somewhat. Any questions? All right, thank you. Well, let's move on. Now, this negative influence, though, on children can be difficult to offset. there have been incidents where boys have been encouraged by offenders to even adopt criminal aspirations and to imitate imprisoned loved ones with pride. We know that boys on the street have been induced by drug dealers to be the go-between between they and whoever they're distributing drugs to, simply by giving them money and by telling them things like, at your age, the law can't hurt you, so we want you to do this, we want you to do that, and they're paid. And you see these guys hanging out on street corners, some of them just hanging out, but some of the guys that hang out on street corners, especially if you see one always in the same spot, chances are that he's offering drugs at the behest of some drug dealer. Major problem. You all be careful, because drug dealers like to hang college students. We have so many arrests of this college students who start out with a clean slate, but who end up being pulled into the web of drug addiction and are dependent upon who we used to call a pusher. Try to develop your peer group within the academic community that you're in. That's what I tell them. That's what I tell my children when off to school. I told my daughters, I said, I better not come down to visit you, bring you some money, and see you walk around with somebody, a man with earrings on, pump shoes, his britches halfway down his behind. No, persona non grata for me. And it's not a thing of generational gapping, it's a thing of just moral perspective. You always have to pair yourselves with someone who is morally straight, who is going to be not only a benefit to himself, but a benefit to you. Because this is your mate. This is your equalizer. And it's going to be good. But stay away from traps. You'll be able to discern that, I'm sure. Now let's look at some of these things. Now, relative to this, now there are very few political prisoners. I wrote this in 2016, so I have in 2016, as compared to 30 years ago, when there were a number of political prisoners. That's a different kind of person. But I'm not talking about them. Therefore, to many young people, young men particularly, crime is understood to be an acceptable option and a self-glorifying way of life. This concept of the pipeline from schools to prison, that's real. I don't think I could have functioned in an academic environment where everything is play, where everything is non-important. I was blessed to grow up with students who were achievers. They knew their worth. I used to sit behind a girl. I'll never forget her. Her name was Barbara Jean Mayo, and she was so smart. And we had the math test in the 5th grade. I sat right behind her. I used to look over and see where she was ranked. I ranked the same thing. I used to take her pigtails. You know what pigtails are? You sure you know what pigtails are? She used to wear pigtails with a ribbon on. She wore 2 with a ribbon on. And then when we said inkwells on our desk, no, I have inkwells on the desk. You do? Good. Ink, but we had ink in them. And we used to dip our pens with some things that are. I used to take her braid on the right braid and dip it in the inkwell. I had all kind of fantasies about Barbara Jean Mayo. Woo! That was my first heartthrob. You know what? She didn't even know I existed. Good grief. But she was smart. So I could sit right behind her. The teacher didn't catch me. I'd do my looking over there. She wrote big. She always wrote from the right side. And I played directly into my terrible, terrible ways. But those are good days. Now I want to talk to you about something you know about. Now, glorifying crime in the criminal life. Now, there have been 3 movies. All of them were made in the 1970s, before you were born, but you've seen them, I know, because they've been on television. One was shown here. No, I'm sorry, R.I.T. I think you've seen them. But these movies from nearly 40 years ago actually, glorified crime and its exponents, and which influenced numberless boys and young men. 3 movies. Superfly, The Godfather, and finally Scarface. The men depicted in these movies were anti-heroes, that's what they call them today. But they had such an impact on society as a whole. A lot of it being fallacious, but a lot of it being true. Scarface was a remake of a movie, I think, made in the 30s, and it had a much stronger impact, particularly upon Latin guys. I've talked to a lot of Latino brothers, and they love. I always like to ask you, what is your favorite movie? Scarface. I watched it. It was a little long for me. I would always fall asleep before the end of it, whenever it was on TV. But it was a very violent film, as you've seen it, especially toward the end. Superfly was just that really caught the fancy of those who felt they can make money by pimping women and distributing drugs. Superfly changed fashions, hats, coats, suits, shoes, everything. But what happened with all of these? They influence crime and violence. And from this grisly period would also come the scourge of drugs and its criminal and homicidal implications. And it continues its flirtation among young people and brings death at an early age. You bury young people. Things have changed. Young people used to bury their parents. Today, in many instances, parents bury young people. Now, drugs, let's dwell on this just for a moment, especially since the 1980s, drugs of crack cocaine have resulted in near epidemic form. And it's a crass revisitation of the Rockefeller drug law. So many attempts have been made to repeal the Rockefeller drug law. A lot of attempts to kind of moderate the Rockefeller drug law. But the Rockefeller drug law said if you're caught, arrested as a person involved in the selling of drugs, 25 to life, no exceptions. No parole, 25 years to life. Which means that we still have people in prison under this mandate. But the thing is that drugs have caused such an increase of negative monetary gain. It's caused homicide. to become to many an acceptable form of vengeance or revenge of any nature. As a consequence, the many victims of usage have displayed various mental and emotional behavioral patterns that have exhibited the need for treatment. Now, this period at times is passed down to families, especially to parents, which can produce a whole lot of guilt. A lot of guilt. Questions, please. Yes.
I guess it's more of a comment. I have kind of seen what you're talking about, you know, in that my next door neighbor is a drug dealer
Oh.
and has a bustling business, which he runs out of his house.
You know that he's a drug dealer?
I know that he's a drug dealer because I've seen, well, I mean, at first I kind of suspected because I would see, there's like this little like alley kind of next, there's like an alley like between my house and his house, and like, I would always see people pulling up in cars, you know, at all hours of the day and night, getting out, you know, making little exchanges, and then and this guy, I mean, he's always been, you know, nice to me, and, you know, one day I was talking to him, I was walking my dog, and, because I had a puppy, I was walking her, and then I saw him, you know, sitting outside, and just like, hey, how you doing, and he like fell, like, he's this kind of older guy, he walks with a cane, not, you know, I wouldn't, not somebody that necessarily looks like a drug dealer, but he like tripped and fell down, and I was like, are you okay? And he was like, you know, coughing, like kind of spitting up blood, and I was like, sir, are you okay? Do you need help? And he was like, oh yeah, I'm fine, I just smoked some bad crack, and I thought,
That's one way to find out.
yeah, and so he was like, you know, I kind of, I helped him get up, and I introduced myself, and he was like, oh, I'm your neighbor, and he was like, and I've seen him, I think they must be his kids or family, but I don't know who they are, but just all these people, they all like kind of congregate, they all hang out, and then these other people kind of come by, and like, there's a lot of coming and going, and there's a lot of kids there too.
Yeah.
You know, but I've seen people I've seen drug paraphernalia around, so I know there's something, but, you know, like, what can you do?
Yeah, well, the paraphernalia, it's just always a giveaway. But let's bear in mind that not all pushers operate out of poor neighborhoods. You have professional men who have been arrested, you know, high-level professionals, but part of their makeup is that they sell drugs, or they distribute drugs, or they're utilizing drugs for themselves. And while their prison sentencing isn't as long as a poor person for the same crimes, nonetheless, it does happen at that level. So you have to be very, very careful. Even professors have been found to be, you know, addicts and distributors of drugs. So if you take a class and your professor does a lot of twitching, watch out, might not be quite for you. But you know, don't want to cast any aspersions. But crack cocaine has kind of changed the landscape a lot. Now, we talked about families, and we talked about the impact that returning incarcerants have on their families. There's another section where we need to deal with, and as adults, we can take it, because our next our next area will be sexuality and the lingering trauma of incarceration. Before we go ahead, question? Yes.
I have a comment. So I think it's funny, not funny, but like ironic that you said people that you would never expect or would are those who use drugs. Well, my friend, her mom married this guy, so her stepdad is an officer. He's a state trooper, actually.
Yeah.
And I guess when they don't have anywhere for the state troopers to go, they put them in the neighborhoods to like, just do rounds or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So he moved in, whatever, and my friend didn't really think anything of it. And then he had all his cop buddies come over, right? And I guess if a cop pulls you over and you have drugs and they don't give you a ticket or like they just confiscate your drugs and stuff, they don't have to report it.
Mm-hmm. No, they don't.
And the cop, like there are like 12 state troopers sitting in my friend's living room using all the drugs that they found that day. Or yeah.
Oh my god.
And then they were like telling stories. They're like, yeah, this one kid thought he was going to jail, but I just took his stuff. And I was like, oh my god. Like, that's so frustrating because they like have this God complex when they pull you over.
Yeah.
And then it's like, you're not better. I don't know.
Yeah, but it's a problem among law enforcement as well. I'll tell you, there's another area where there's a great deal of addiction. The alcohol has always been there, but of late, with some of the younger violators, drugs have come into question. And that's in the church, in both the Catholic Church and in the various Protestant churches that we have throughout the country. A lot of its leaders, and not only the spiritual leaders, but those who do a lot of counseling to young people within this framework, have been arrested for the use of drugs and criminal offenses. So wherever you go, you're going to find people who are going to be disobedient to the laws of the land when it comes to drug addiction. But one need not even have to, check with the state or with any kind of authoritative institution with respect to the what drugs can do. Just take a moment to rationalize yourself, what drugs can do to you, how it can change your thinking, how it can change certainly your health. You can be a healthy person. Once you get on drugs, you become addicted, chances are you're not going to live the full course of your life. Many people on drugs die at a very, very early age, especially through this crack cocaine, which has become kind of like the new heroin. Now heroin is coming back. Heroin is invading high schools, and the number of persons who have died of heroin overdoses has become almost astronomical in some places. So you have to kind of hold on. Stay away from any kind of drug. You stay away from aspirin. Deal with a headache. Drink coffee. But you deal with a headache in a way that you don't become addicted to anything. Yes.
So I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, which I was actually watching the news, like the local news in Rochester, and our heroin epidemic is so bad that it was reported on in the local news in Rochester because, like, at some points there's over probably 120 overdose calls per week, and
That's
there
so
were at one point there was 30 overdose calls in a day for heroin overdoses, and like, why?
Yeah, and what this means too is that it's cheap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're having to double our local police force to have enough responders to deal with all of the heroin overdoses.
Is Louisville that big of a city?
It's including the suburbs, it's 300,000.
Okay.
So it's not. I mean, it's a solid sized city, but it's not 30
Right.
heroin overdoses a day size city.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you, boy. That's tough. Yes.
Just to sort of add to that, I guess one of the I would say probably one of the saddest calls, EMT calls that I've responded to was here in Rochester,
Uh-huh.
and there was a 29-year-old woman who had, we called because she had difficulty breathing, but it turned out she had not only asthma and COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is usually something that you see in middle-aged people who have smoked for 30 years, not 29-year-old people. We gave her a bunch of, inhaled medications, like oral steroids that are like stronger than like what you would have in an inhaler, but it didn't help. And I was with a paramedic, and we both listened to her lungs, and we heard like sort of, in people with like heart failure, you can hear the fluid, and it sounded like she had heart failure, congestive heart failure, and she said that she'd been smoking crack for like 13 years.
13?
13 years. And probably, it was striking. I'll never, because she was so young, and she had kids too. She had little kids, and I don't know what, we weren't really able to help her that much. We brought her to the hospital, but sometimes I wonder about people.
Well, smoking in itself without crack cocaine can do a lot of damage to your heart. But I imagine if you're smoking cocaine or any kind of drug, it just adds to the possibility of physical danger. And I'm glad that you mentioned smoking crack cocaine, because that tends to be the most popular method of ingesting it these days. Crack cocaine, I think, hit the streets about 1982, 1983, somewhere around in there, and within 10 years it had produced so much sickness and so many homicides directly related to it that it's very, very hard to keep up with. You know, of course, that people on crack cocaine and other serious drugs have inflicted damage even upon people in their families for money and for things, to steal and to sell for money just to do this. It's caused mental illness. It's caused a lot of frightening things. So this whole question of criminality and poverty and drugs is really real. And I say to myself, how in the world, if you're poor, how in the world can you afford to buy drugs? How can you afford to buy whiskey and all that stuff if you're addicted and you're very, very poor? But there's always a way. And maybe that's what needs to be done. But I know with young people, there has to be, in schools and in religious institutions, programs of prevention, within families, educative programs on prevention, being able to detect, just like we're doing with child abuse. What's our time? Whoa, okay. I'll say this, and I promise, curtains, but even with areas of various forms of child abuse, we feel that preventive measures can be very, very helpful, necessary, and identifying when a child is really suffering from abuse is key, and we have ways in which we do that. All right,